June 6, 1944, 00:15 hours. Strongpoint WN-62, Omaha Beach. In the pre-dawn blackness blanketing the Normandy coast, a young German soldier, Gefreiter Heinrich Severloh, performed the meticulous, ritualistic task of cleaning the barrel of his MG-42 machine gun. The cold, damp air within the concrete casemate was heavy with the smell of oil and the sea. His world was confined to this fortified position, a key node in the defensive network known as the Atlantic Wall. In his pocket, he carried not just a letter, but a tangible piece of a life he hoped to return to, a promise from his girlfriend in Mecklenburg to wait for him until the war reached its victorious conclusion. Just 3 days prior, buoyed by the confidence instilled from the highest levels of command, he had written to her, his words echoing the supreme assurance of his leaders. "The invasion will be their grave. We will throw them back into the sea within hours." This conviction had been cemented by the personal inspection of General Feldmarschall Erwin Rommel himself. The legendary Desert Fox had peered through Seal's own gun aperture, studying the interlocking, murderous fields of fire his position commanded. His nod of approval was more than a gesture. It was a sacrament of defensive faith. "When they come," Rommel had declared, his words resonating in the bunker, "this beach will be their cemetery." Now, as Seal looked through his own embrasure, he saw only a peaceful, serene darkness over the English Channel. The night was calm, almost deceptively so. In a mere 12 hours, this same young man would be found huddled and broken inside that same bunker, weeping uncontrollably. He would be surrounded by a staggering 13,500 empty brass shell casings, the very barrel of his machine gun warped and ruined from the relentless, sustained heat of fire. He would be a witness to an invasion force of such immense, incomprehensible scale that his mind, trained for a certain kind of battle, would simply refuse to process the reality his eyes were seeing. Though Seal would later claim to have inflicted between 1,000 and 2,000 casualties, historians universally regard this as a physical and statistical impossibility, given that the total American casualties at Omaha Beach from all causes, drowning, artillery, small arms fire, were approximately 2,400. The cold, unforgiving mathematics of the German defeat were about to be written not in the abstract lines of strategic assessments or intelligence reports, but in the shocked, visceral testimonies of soldiers like Seal, who found themselves on the wrong side of the gun sight during the largest amphibious invasion in human history. The illusion of impregnability. The Atlantic Wall. The German propaganda machine had ceaselessly touted the Atlantic Wall as the most formidable defensive line ever constructed. Stretching an almost absurd 2,400 miles from the fjords of Norway to the border of Spain, it was a monumental, if thinly spread, feat of military engineering. Along the Normandy coast alone, 58 divisions of varying quality and morale manned positions that had consumed 17 million cubic meters of concrete and 1.2 million tons of steel. Adolf Hitler himself had declared it impregnable. The defensive preparations at Omaha Beach seemed to justify such bold claims. According to meticulous U.S. Army records, the Germans had transformed the area into a layered killing ground. The defenses included 8 massive concrete bunkers, 35 smaller but deadly pillboxes, 4 heavy artillery positions, 18 anti-tank gun emplacements, 45 rocket launcher sites, 85 machine gun nests, and 6 mortar pits. The beach itself was a deadly obstacle course. 3,700 obstructions littered the tidal zone, Belgian gates, Czech hedgehogs, and wooden stakes, many tipped with teller mines designed to rip landing craft apart. Behind the beaches lay a vast minefield. Though Rommel's ambitious request for 60 million mines had been scaled back to a still formidable 6.5 million. Commanders like Colonel Ernst Goth of the 916th Grenadier Regiment had calculated their defensive firepower with mathematical precision. His 4 artillery batteries could theoretically deliver 120 rounds per minute onto the landing sectors. When combined with other batteries, the Germans could concentrate a devastating weight of steel on any landing attempt. These calculations, however, rested on a fatal, unstated assumption: unlimited ammunition. This assumption would prove to be one of the campaign's most critical flaws. The first miscalculation: a forecast of complacency. June 5th brought with it weather so foul that it bred a catastrophic sense of security within the German High Command. In Paris, Luftwaffe meteorologist Dr. Walter Stoeber, relying on data from U-boats and weather stations, analyzed wind speeds of 20 to 25 knots, 6-foot waves, and a low cloud ceiling of 500 feet. He confidently assured his superiors that such conditions would persist for at least 2 weeks, making a large-scale amphibious assault impossible. This forecast triggered a chain of complacency. Many senior officers, believing the invasion window closed, left their posts. Rommel himself departed for Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday, carrying a pair of grey suede shoes purchased in Paris as a gift. General Friedrich Dollmann, commanding the 7th Army, ordered his division commanders to attend a map exercise in Rennes. The Kriegsmarine even cancelled its routine channel patrols due to the rough seas. This meteorological confidence was the first in a series of cascading German miscalculations. Unknown to Stoeber, the Allies possessed a superior weather prediction network, with stations in Greenland and dedicated weather flights over the Atlantic. They had detected what he had missed: a brief, critical 36-hour break in the storm. Group Captain James Stagg identified this window, and General Dwight D. Eisenhower, with immense courage, seized it. The night of confusion, paratroopers and panic. Beginning at 23:15 hours on June 5th, German radar stations along the Norman coast began to flicker with unusual activity. Freya and Würzburg radar sets painted the skies with contacts, indicating massive aerial formations approaching from the north. Initially, the seasoned operators were skeptical. They had seen this before. The Allies were known for their deception raids, designed to fatigue and confuse the defenders. But by 0030 hours on June 6th, the scattered, chaotic reports flooding command centers could no longer be dismissed as mere feints. Paratroopers from the US 101st and 82nd Airborne and the British 6th Airborne Divisions were landing across the Cotentin Peninsula and east of the Orne River. Yet the reports were bewildering. Some units reported landings to the east, others to the west. Some claimed they were British, others American. This confusion was deliberately amplified by Allied operations Titanic and Rupert, which dropped hundreds of dummy paratroopers, rudimentary dolls with firecrackers attached, that created the illusion of larger, more widespread drops. Major Hans von Luck, commanding the 125th Panzer Grenadier Regiment of the critical 21st Panzer Division, was one of the first to grasp the situation's grave reality. Awakened by reports of paratroopers landing near his positions, he immediately requested permission to mobilize his forces and counterattack. The response from a paralyzed higher command was infuriatingly passive. Do not move until the situation clarifies. Von Luck would later write in his memoirs that he knew at that moment the battle was already lost. The paratroopers were clearly marking the flanks for a major landing. Every minute we waited gave them time to consolidate their positions. Yet we sat, paralyzed by our own rigid and hesitant command structure. Dawn of the Armada, a psychological blow, at approximately 0530 hours, as a faint grey light began to bleed into the sky. German observers manning their forward positions witnessed a sight that defied all their training, propaganda, and comprehension. While the specific presence of certain observers like Verluscart is disputed by historians, including Seal himself, what is undeniable is that across the Normandy coast, German soldiers stared out at a sea that was no longer there. From horizon to horizon, the channel was choked with ships, not dozens, not even hundreds, but thousands. The official Allied records would later confirm the staggering scale, 6,939 vessels. This armada included 1,213 warships, from mighty battleships to nimble destroyers, 4,126 landing craft of every type, 736 ancillary vessels, and 864 merchant ships. It was a floating city, a manifestation of industrial power that was psychologically devastating to defenders raised on narratives of Allied weakness and indecision. Bernhard Fröking, an artillery officer at WN-62 who would be killed later that day, reportedly turned to his men and said, with chilling prescience, "What you see here is the entire world arriving at our doorstep." The naval bombardment, the unmaking of the wall. At 05:35 hours, the naval bombardment began. Nothing in the experience of the German defenders, not the brutal barrages of the Eastern Front, nor the heaviest RAF bombing raids, could have prepared them for the storm that was unleashed upon them. It was not merely an artillery barrage, it was a geological event. The battleship USS Texas, for example, fired 255 of its massive 14-inch shells at the Pointe du Hoc battery in just 34 minutes. The British cruiser HMS Warspite, one of the first ships to open fire, would deliver over 300 of its 15-inch shells in the first 2 days. The cumulative effect of hundreds of naval guns, firing in a coordinated, relentless symphony of destruction, exceeded any firepower the Wehrmacht had ever encountered. Veteran accounts collected by the German Federal Archives describe a hellish landscape. Concrete bunkers, designed to be impervious, cracked and splintered under direct hits. Men were buried alive by concussions, dug out by their comrades, only to be buried again as the shelling continued unabated. The psychological impact was as profound as the physical destruction. The fortifications in which they had placed absolute, almost religious faith were being reduced to rubble around them. The impregnable wall was crumbling like a sand castle before the tide. The absent Luftwaffe, a promise broken. As the naval guns thundered, the promised response from the Luftwaffe revealed the hollow core of German air power. Oberstleutnant Josef Pips Priller, commanding Jagdgeschwader 26, received orders to attack the invasion fleet with his entire force. His response, recorded in the Wing's war diary, was a masterpiece of bleak irony. "What entire force? I have 2 planes." The Luftwaffe, which had vowed to achieve air superiority over any invasion beachhead, could muster a pitiful 319 sorties on D-Day against the Allies' 14,674. According to U.S. Navy records, Priller and his wingman, Unteroffizier Heinz Wodarczyk, made what was likely the only Luftwaffe strafing run on the beaches during the crucial morning hours. In their Focke-Wulf FW-198 fighters, they screamed over Sword Beach once, their cannon fire a futile gesture against the thousands of vessels below, before fleeing from the overwhelming swarm of Allied fighter cover. This single, symbolic attack by 2 aircraft against an armada of thousands became the ultimate testament to German aerial impotence. Bloody Omaha, the machine gunner's ordeal, at 06:30 hours, the first American assault waves hit the beaches. Despite the horrific bombardment, German discipline held, and the surviving defenders scrambled to their positions. What followed was a carnage that shocked even the most battle-hardened veterans. Heinrich Severloh, from his relatively unscathed position at WN-62, began firing his MG-42 at 06:35 hours. His bunker commanded a near-perfect field of fire across the entire sector of Omaha Beach. In his 2005 memoir, he stated he fired approximately 13,500 rounds over 9 hours, the weapon's high rate of fire, 200 rounds per minute in bursts, making this claim plausible. While Severloh would assert he caused massive casualties, military historians emphasize that his position, though lethally effective, was one of many factors in the tragic equation of Bloody Omaha. The specific numbers he claimed cannot be verified against the overall casualty figures. What is undeniable is the phenomenon of material shock that began to grip the German defenders. No matter how many landing craft were destroyed, No matter how many American soldiers fell on the shingle, more always appeared. It was a relentless, seemingly inexhaustible tide of men and machines. Every silenced machine gun nest was pinpointed and obliterated by naval gunfire that appeared to be in limitless supply. The ammunition crisis, the collapse of a plan. By midday, the German defensive plan began to unravel at its most fundamental level: logistics. Reports started to stream in from forward positions of critical ammunition shortages. The meticulous pre-invasion calculations had been based on repelling a limited, perhaps division-sized assault. No one had planned for a continuous, multi-divisional attack supported by endless naval gunfire. According to Wehrmacht supply records, positions stocked with ammunition for a 3-day battle exhausted their supplies in a matter of hours. Artillery batteries, the backbone of the static defense, faced the same crisis. Their carefully husbanded shell reserves vanished in the intense, sustained combat. Attempts to move reserve ammunition stocks from depots further inland failed disastrously. Every road and railway line was under constant, merciless attack from Allied fighter bombers, the dreaded Jabos. The contrast with Allied logistics was stark and disheartening. German observers noted in awe that American destroyers would fire hundreds of shells at a single suspected machine gun nest, while their own artillery was soon rationed to a handful of shells per gun per day. Paralyzed reserves, the panzers that stood still, the German armored reserve, the force that Rommel had insisted must meet and destroy any invasion on the beaches, remained largely paralyzed through the critical morning hours. The 21st Panzer Division, the only armored unit positioned close to the landing zones, did not receive clear orders to attack until 1,000 hours, a fatal delay of 4 hours after the first landings. When the 21st Panzers finally launched their counterattack at 16:20 hours, they advanced between the British airborne landing zones toward the coast. Divisional records show they actually reached the shoreline between Lyon-sur-Mer and Luc-sur-Mer around 1900 hours, becoming the only German armored unit to reach the coast on D-Day. However, their success was short-lived. At 2100 hours, they witnessed the awe-inspiring and terrifying spectacle of Operation Mallard, 250 gliders bringing in massive reinforcements for the British 6th Airborne Division. Interpreting this vast air armada as a threat to their flanks and rear, the German commanders ordered a withdrawal. The division lost 54 tanks and armored vehicles that day, a quarter of its strength wiped out in a single day's fighting. Furthermore, the German panzers encountered specialized Allied armor, Hobart's Funnies, which seemed to belong to a future era of warfare. These modified tanks, with flails for mine clearing, crab, flamethrowers, crocodile, and bridging equipment, allowed the Allies to overcome obstacles the Germans had believed would channel the infantry into killing zones. The ghosts behind the lines. The airborne menace throughout D-Day, German units faced a pervasive and demoralizing threat they had never encountered on such a scale. Massive, effective airborne forces operating deep behind their lines. The British 6th and the American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions created a state of chaos that multiplied their actual numbers exponentially. Oberst Friedrich von der Heydte, Germany's own most experienced paratrooper commander, was in Normandy during the invasion. His professional assessment, recorded in post-war interviews, was damning. The Allied airborne operation was everything ours had never been. It was massive, perfectly coordinated, and lavishly supplied. We dropped battalions, they dropped entire divisions. We were supplied by a handful of aircraft. They had endless streams of gliders and transport planes. The psychological impact of paratroopers reportedly being everywhere had a paralyzing effect on German responses. Units refused to move for fear of ambush. Others fired at shadows, and, in the confusion, sometimes at their own men. This fog of war, deliberately generated by the Allies, crippled German command and control. The disintegration of command. As D-Day progressed, the German command structure disintegrated. Allied aircraft systematically targeted communication lines. The French resistance, activated by coded messages from the BBC, sprang into action, cutting telephone cables and destroying relay stations. Allied electronic warfare units jammed German radio frequencies. General Lieutenant Max Pemsel, Chief of Staff of the 7th Army, attempted to coordinate the defense from his headquarters at Le Mans. His war diary entries reflect mounting frustration and despair as contact with one forward unit after another was lost. By noon on June 6th, entire divisions had effectively vanished from the command network. Isolated unit commanders were forced to make critical decisions in a vacuum, with no understanding of the broader tactical picture. The aftermath? A world transformed. As darkness fell on June 6th, the surviving German defenders took stock of a world turned upside down. The Atlantic Wall had been breached in multiple places. The Luftwaffe was a non-entity over Normandy. The Kriegsmarine had managed to sink one destroyer, the USS Corrie, at the cost of 15 E-boats and numerous smaller craft. General Wilhelm Richter, commanding the 7th 16th Infantry Division, which had borne the brunt of the British and Canadian assaults, reported to 7th Army headquarters with brutal clarity. Division combat strength, 35%. All coastal strongpoints lost. Artillery, 90% destroyed. Enemy advancing inland. The statistics told a story of utter tactical failure, despite countless individual acts of heroism and sacrifice. Throughout the night and the weeks that followed, the German plight only worsened. Allied reinforcements poured ashore with relentless industrial efficiency. The artificial mulberry harbours were assembled, creating instant ports that defied the lack of a major captured harbour. Hans von Luck's Panzer Grenadiers, finally released for a night counterattack, found their movements illuminated by parachute flares and shattered by precisely aimed naval gunfire. It was like daylight. Von Luck wrote, "We lost half our strength without ever seeing a single enemy soldier." The logistical disparity became the defining theme of the Battle of Normandy. The German 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, stationed near Toulouse, took 17 nightmarish days to reach the front, a journey that should have taken 3. They arrived having lost 30% of their vehicles to incessant air attack, without having fired a shot in ground combat. Meanwhile, the Allies landed 15,000 tons of supplies daily within days of the invasion, more than the entire German army in Normandy could consume in a week. By the time Operation Cobra erupted on July 25th, the end was near. The preparatory bombing, involving over 1,500 heavy bombers, was of such cataclysmic intensity that it killed the highest-ranking American officer to die in the European theater, Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, who was observing from a position thought to be safe. If American generals were not safe from their own firepower, what hope did the German soldiers in the target zone have? The subsequent Falaise Pocket in August became the gruesome finale. Approximately 10,000 Germans died, and 50,000 were captured in a cauldron of destruction described by survivors as apocalyptic. Roads were paved with dead horses and burning vehicles, and Allied aircraft attacked in relentless, timed waves. The final reckoning and the lessons learned. The final accounting was a testament to industrial-scale warfare. German losses from June 6th to August 31st were catastrophic. Approximately 320,000 casualties, 30,000 killed, 80,000 wounded, 10,000 captured, 2,300 tanks destroyed, and 2,127 aircraft lost. Allied losses, while heavy, were replaceable. They lost about 4,000 tanks, but replaced them within weeks. They lost 4,100 aircraft, but had a force exceeding 13,000. The professional assessments of German commanders were unanimous in their conclusion. General der Panzertruppen Heinrich Eberbach reported to OKW, "The enemy's material superiority is at least 20-1 in artillery, 10-1 in tanks, and absolute in aircraft. He can replace all losses within days. We cannot replace anything." Rommel, in his final report to Hitler on July 15th, wrote with stark clarity, "The troops are fighting heroically everywhere, but the unequal struggle is nearing its end. I must beg you to draw the necessary conclusions without delay." The German soldiers who survived Normandy were psychologically transformed. They had witnessed the complete invalidation of their military doctrine, their propaganda, and their belief in ultimate victory. They had not been defeated by a lack of courage, but by a new form of warfare where production statistics mattered more than tactical brilliance. Heinrich Severloh, who began June 6th believing he could single-handedly influence the battle, ended it surrounded by the empty brass of his efforts, watching an endless stream of reinforcements that rendered his bravery a statistical footnote. Hans von Luck reflected that they had learned modern war was not about tactics or courage, but about production. The Americans had turned war into an industrial process. They manufactured victory on assembly lines. D-Day, from the German perspective, was more than a military defeat. It was an ideological and psychological collapse. Soldiers who had conquered a continent discovered that everything they believed about their enemies and their own capabilities was catastrophically wrong. They had faced the arsenal of democracy in its full, terrifying efficiency. Their defeat was total, a crushing demonstration that in the age of industrial warfare, a nation's courage and skill could be overwhelmed by the sheer, relentless mathematics of production and supply. They had tried to hold back the tide, and the tide had simply swept them away. The erosion of the warrior spirit. The weeks following June 6th saw not just a territorial retreat, but a fundamental erosion of the German soldier's spirit. The initial shock of the invasion hardened into a grim, grinding reality. They were no longer defending a fortified wall. They were fighting a slow, bloody withdrawal through the labyrinthine hedgerows of the Norman bocage. This terrain, which initially offered defensive advantages, soon became a nightmare of isolation and sudden, violent death. American and British units, equipped with superior intelligence, overwhelming artillery support, and air dominance, learned to systematically reduce each hedge-lined field. The German soldier, often cut off from his command and low on everything from ammunition to morale, fought on in small, desperate pockets. The psychological warfare was as potent as the physical. Leaflets dropped by Allied planes detailed the fall of Cherbourg and the advances in the east, breaking the news of the Soviet Operation Bagration, which was annihilating Army Group Center. The constant demoralizing "Thröke for Ike" Morse code signal, tapped out by Allied psychological operations units over loudspeakers and radio jammers, became the soundtrack to their despair. It was a reminder that they were facing not just an army, but a coordinated global effort directed by a single, unseen hand. The myth of technological superiority shattered. The German military had long clung to a narrative of qualitative superiority. The Tiger and Panther tanks were, indeed, fearsome machines, capable of destroying Allied Shermans at long range. The story of Michael Wittmann's rampage at Villers-Bocage on June 13th was seized upon by German propaganda and passed from unit to unit. A brief, bright flare of the old, invincible warrior myth. In that single engagement, Wittmann's Tiger tank was credited with destroying dozens of British vehicles, showcasing the devastating potential of German armor. Yet even this victory revealed the futility of their position. Wittmann's Tiger was eventually disabled and abandoned. The British losses, though severe, were replaced within hours. The German replacement system, by contrast, was crippled. A disabled Tiger was a monumental loss. A destroyed Sherman was a statistic on an American production log. The Allies could afford to trade 5, even 10 tanks for one Tiger. The mathematical certainty of this attrition was inescapable. Wittmann himself, the personification of the tank ace, was killed on August 8th when his Tiger was destroyed. Whether by a shot from British gunner Joe Eakins or Canadian forces, his fate was sealed not by a superior warrior, but by the sheer, overwhelming volume of the Allied war machine. The logistics of defeat, the war of the rear echelons. While the front-line soldier grappled with fear and material lack, the German logistical system entered a state of catastrophic failure. The Allied interdiction campaign, Operation Transportation Plan, had been devastatingly effective. Every bridge over the Seine, Loire, and Rhône rivers was systematically destroyed. Railways were transformed into twisted, cratered ruins. Marshalling yards were lunar landscapes of bomb craters. The journey of a German reinforcement division to the front became an epic of destruction in itself. A soldier might spend more time hiding from fighter bombers in ditches than moving toward the battle. Supply columns moved only at night, and even then they were hunted by Allied aircraft equipped with radar and flares. A battalion commander's request for ammunition or fuel would take days to reach a depot, and the response, if it came at all, would be a fraction of what was needed. The German army in Normandy was not just being outfought, it was being systematically starved. Soldiers went into counterattacks with a handful of shells for their supporting artillery and a few liters of fuel for their armored vehicles. They watched, in bitter contrast, as the Allies unloaded an unending river of supplies onto the beaches and through the mulberry harbors, a spectacle of plenty that mocked their own deprivation. The human toll, the breaking of the German soldier. By late July and August, the signs of collective psychological breakdown were evident. The term burnout, verbrannt, was used to describe veterans who had simply exhausted their capacity for fear and shock. Desertions, while not on a mass scale, increased. Soldiers surrendered with a sense of relief, often after putting up only a token resistance. The ferocious defense of the Falaise pocket was less a coordinated military action and more a final desperate struggle for survival by a trapped animal. The scenes within the Falaise kettle were those of a modern inferno. The roads leading east were not just blocked, they were carpeted with a macabre tapestry of destruction. Shattered horse-drawn wagons, a stark symbol of German logistical primitivism, burning trucks, and the corpses of men and animals all churned together into a pulp by incessant artillery and aerial bombardment. The Allied fighter bombers, the Jabos, ruled the sky uncontested, strafing and bombing at will. For the German soldier who endured this, the experience was transformative. He was no longer a defender of the Reich. He was a victim of a force of nature, an industrial hurricane that had been unleashed upon him. The commander's lament, the post-war reckoning. In the years that followed, the German commanders who survived were forced to rationalize the defeat. Their writings and interrogations are a chorus of acknowledgement of Allied material supremacy. General Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt, the senior commander in the West, famously dismissed the entire Atlantic Wall as a propaganda bluff and summarized the campaign with the bleak statement, "We were no longer fighting a war, we were being processed by a machine." General der Panzertruppen Leo Geyer von Schweppenberg, commander of Panzer Group West, analyzed the battle as a systemic failure. He wrote that the German command structure was too rigid, its intelligence fatally flawed, and its resources utterly inadequate to face an enemy who had perfected the art of the possible through limitless means. General Major Friedrich August Freiherr von der Heydte, the paratrooper, offered perhaps the most profound philosophical conclusion. He stated that Normandy marked the end of the age of the heroic individual in war. The nightly duel of wills between commanders, the Kunst des Krieges, art of war, of Clausewitz, had been rendered obsolete. It had been replaced by a cold, impersonal calculus of production lines, fuel consumption rates, and ammunition tonnage. The side with the better mathematicians and engineers had won. Heinrich Seel's Long Shadow. The story of Heinrich Seel, the machine gunner of WN-62, is the story of the German experience at Normandy in microcosm. He began his day as a believer in a cause, a confident warrior in an impregnable fortress. He ended it as a broken man, his personal courage and skill rendered meaningless by the sheer scale of the opposition. The 13,500 shell casings that surrounded him were not a testament to his effectiveness. but a monument to the futility of his effort. They were the physical evidence of a system that demanded superhuman sacrifice to achieve a mathematically insignificant delay. In his later years, meeting American veterans, Seal came to a somber realization. He understood that the young men he had fired upon were, like him, cogs in a vast machine. The difference was that their machine was infinitely more powerful, better supplied, and driven by a momentum that could not be stopped. They were not supermen. They were the representatives of a society that had mobilized its entire industrial and human potential with an efficiency that the Third Reich could only mimic in its darkest dreams. Conclusion. The tide of history. The German defense of Normandy was one of the most tactically tenacious and costly campaigns in military history. Yet, its ultimate lesson is that tactical proficiency, when divorced from strategic depth and industrial capacity, leads only to a more prolonged and bloody defeat. The German soldier brought to the battlefield a formidable combination of training, discipline, and courage. The Allies brought the full weight of the 20th century's industrial and technological might. The beaches of Normandy became the anvil upon which the last illusions of German military invincibility were shattered. The defenders learned that you cannot stop the tide with a wall, no matter how well constructed. The tide of liberty, fueled by the boundless arsenal of democracy, was simply too great. It flowed around, over, and through their defenses, not through brute force alone, but through an overwhelming superiority in organization, logistics, and production. The German soldier in Normandy was not defeated by a better man. He was overwhelmed by a better world.